The rifle smoke cleared across the frozen meadow, and Thomas Whitmore lowered his weapon without celebration. 1 mile and 73 yards away, the massive buck lay still in the snow, brought down by a single shot that defied everything other hunters believed possible. The year was 1839, and what Thomas had just accomplished would be dismissed as impossible by every mountain man, trapper, and frontiersman in the Rocky Mountains. But the rifle resting against the boulder, the calculations scratched into his leather journal, and the techniques he had spent 3 brutal winters perfecting told a different story. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about stories of frontier innovation. If tales like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable than this one. Thomas Whitmore arrived in the Rocky Mountains in the spring of 1836 with nothing remarkable to distinguish him from hundreds of other men seeking fortune in beaver pelts. He was 28 years old, competent with a rifle, capable of surviving in the wilderness, and determined to make enough money trapping to buy land back in Missouri. He had learned basic marksmanship from his father, a farmer who kept wolves away from livestock and occasionally brought down deer for the family table. Thomas could hit a target at 100 yards reliably, perhaps 150 yards on a good day with favorable conditions. This was standard competency for the era. Frontier rifles were accurate enough for hunting at reasonable distances and adequate for defense, but nobody seriously discussed shooting beyond 200 yards, except as fantasy or exaggeration. The mountain man culture Thomas entered valued many skills: tracking, trapping, wilderness navigation, survival through harsh winters, and competence in confrontations with both wildlife and hostile humans. Shooting ability mattered, but exceptional marksmanship wasn't particularly celebrated because the practical limits of black powder rifles made extreme accuracy irrelevant. You got close to your target, you aimed carefully, you fired, and if you had done everything correctly, you hit what you aimed at. Beyond certain distances, too many variables made accuracy impossible. Wind deflected the ball. Gravity pulled it down in unpredictable arcs. Minor differences in powder loads changed velocity. The rifling and barrels wore unevenly. No 2 shots were identical, even under controlled conditions. Thomas accepted these limitations initially. During his first season trapping along the tributaries feeding into the Yellowstone River, he hunted elk and deer for meat using conventional methods. He tracked animals, got within 100 yards or closer, found stable shooting positions, and took careful shots. His success rate was acceptable. He wasted little ammunition and rarely wounded animals that escaped to die slowly. But in October of 1836, something happened that changed his entire perspective on what rifles could accomplish. Thomas had been checking trap lines in a high valley when he spotted a massive elk herd moving through open terrain nearly half a mile away. The distance made hunting impossible by conventional standards, so he simply watched through the crude spyglass he carried for scouting. As he observed, he noticed something peculiar. The lead cow elk stopped suddenly and collapsed. Seconds later, he heard the distant crack of a rifle shot echoing off the surrounding peaks. Someone had shot that elk from a distance Thomas would have considered absurd. He watched the herd scatter while a lone figure emerged from the tree line, walked calmly across the meadow, and began field dressing the animal. Thomas had to know who had made that shot and how they had done it. Thomas tracked the unknown hunter back to a small camp tucked into a protected hollow 3 miles from where the elk had fallen. The camp was neat and organized in a way that suggested military training or exceptional discipline. A single canvas lean-to faced away from prevailing winds. Fire pit arranged with rocks for efficient heat reflection, tools and equipment stored in logical positions. The man himself sat cleaning his rifle with methodical care, and he looked up without surprise as Thomas approached, as though he had expected company. His name was Jacob Marston, and he was 52 years old. He had served as a sharpshooter in the War of 1812, spent 15 years as a buffalo hunter on the plains, and had come to the mountains 5 years earlier when buffalo populations declined. He was lean, weathered, and spoke with the economy of someone who spent most of his time alone. When Thomas asked about the shot he had witnessed, Jacob smiled slightly and asked what Thomas wanted to know. "Everything," Thomas replied. Jacob considered this for a long moment, then invited Thomas to sit. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered territory Thomas had never considered. Jacob explained that long-distance shooting wasn't impossible. It was simply difficult enough that most men never bothered learning. The skills required went far beyond basic marksmanship. You needed to understand ballistics, the curved path a ball traveled after leaving the barrel. You needed to judge distance accurately, not through guessing, but through systematic observation and calculation. You needed to read wind at multiple distances simultaneously, because wind near you might differ from wind halfway to the target. You needed to understand how temperature affected powder combustion and how humidity changed everything. You needed a rifle built to far tighter tolerances than standard production weapons. And you needed thousands of rounds of practice to internalize all these variables until they became instinctive. Jacob had spent 2 decades learning these skills through systematic experimentation. He kept detailed journals documenting every long-distance shot he attempted, recording distance, wind conditions, temperature, the amount of powder used, the angle of the shot, and whether he hit or missed. Over time, patterns emerged. He learned that certain powder loads performed more consistently. He learned how to judge wind by watching grass movement and feeling air pressure on his face. He learned that shooting slightly uphill or downhill required adjusting his aim in counterintuitive ways. He learned that early morning shots often flew differently than afternoon shots because temperature changed air density. Most importantly, Jacob had learned to modify his rifles. He showed Thomas his primary hunting rifle, and Thomas immediately noticed differences from standard weapons. The barrel was longer, providing more distance for the powder to accelerate the ball. The rifling grooves were cut deeper and with a faster twist rate, spinning the ball more aggressively for greater stability. The trigger mechanism was tuned to break cleanly at exactly the same pressure every time. The stock was shaped to fit Jacob's shoulder and face precisely, eliminating variables in how he positioned the weapon. Every element had been refined through trial and error to maximize consistency. Thomas asked if Jacob would teach him. Jacob looked at him carefully, then asked why Thomas wanted to learn. Thomas struggled to articulate his answer. He wasn't sure himself why witnessing that single shot had affected him so profoundly. Finally, he said that he had spent his entire life accepting limitations that others told him were absolute, and watching Jacob make that shot proved those limitations were negotiable. If a man could learn to shoot accurately at half a mile, what other impossible things might become possible through knowledge and practice? Jacob nodded slowly, seeming to understand something Thomas hadn't quite said aloud. He agreed to teach Thomas, but only under specific conditions. First, Thomas would need to spend the entire winter with Jacob, learning systematically rather than rushing through abbreviated lessons. Second, Thomas would need to abandon trapping for that season, accepting the financial loss. Third, Thomas would need to follow Jacob's instruction exactly, even when it seemed tedious or unnecessary. Fourth, Thomas would need to keep a detailed journal documenting everything he learned, because knowledge unrecorded was knowledge that died with you. And fifth, Thomas would eventually need to teach someone else, passing the skills forward rather than hoarding them selfishly. Thomas agreed to all 5 conditions immediately. The education began the next morning and proved far more demanding than Thomas had anticipated. Jacob started not with shooting, but with mathematics. Thomas needed to understand basic geometry, to calculate distances and angles. He needed to grasp principles of physics governing how objects move through air. He needed to learn systematic observation, recording data with precision rather than rough estimates. For 2 weeks, Thomas barely touched a rifle. Instead, he practiced estimating distances to objects, then pacing them off to check accuracy. He learned to judge wind speed by observing natural indicators like swaying grass, moving branches, and drifting smoke. He practiced calculating how much a ball would drop over various distances based on different powder loads. Jacob had developed a system of reference points. He knew, for example, that his standard hunting load would drop approximately 18 inches at 300 yards, 60 inches at 500 yards, and over 200 inches at 800 yards. These numbers came from years of practical testing, and Jacob had them memorized for multiple powder loads and different ball weights. He taught Thomas to create similar references through methodical range work. They would shoot at targets placed at measured distances, recording exactly where each shot hit relative to point of aim. Over time, patterns emerged that allowed predictions. The rifle work began in the third week. Jacob insisted Thomas start with a standard production rifle to understand its limitations before moving to modified weapons. Thomas spent hours shooting at targets 100 yards away, not trying for perfect accuracy but developing absolute consistency in his shooting process. Jacob emphasized that long-distance shooting required eliminating variables through ritual. You loaded the rifle exactly the same way every time. You positioned your body identically for every shot. You controlled your breathing through a specific pattern. You squeezed the trigger with precise pressure. Any deviation introduced error that multiplied across distance. Thomas practiced these fundamentals until they became automatic, often shooting 50 rounds daily until his shoulder ached. By mid-November, Thomas had fired over 1,500 rounds under Jacob's supervision, and his shooting at 100 yards had become mechanically consistent. Now Jacob introduced the concept of weapon modification. He explained that production rifles were built for adequate performance at reasonable cost, but exceptional accuracy required customization that most hunters would never bother with. Jacob had 3 rifles in his possession, each modified for specific purposes. His primary hunting rifle was built for shots between 300 and 600 yards. His secondary rifle handled shorter ranges with heavier balls for larger game. His third rifle was purely experimental, designed for attempting shots beyond 800 yards, though Jacob admitted he had only successfully taken game at that distance twice in 5 years. Jacob disassembled his primary rifle completely, laying each component on a clean canvas and explaining its function. The barrel had been custom-made by a gunsmith in St. Louis who specialized in target rifles. The rifling grooves were cut with mathematical precision to impart exactly 1 complete rotation every 48 inches of travel. This was faster than standard production rifles, which typically used 1 rotation per 60 or 70 inches. The faster spin stabilized the ball more effectively, reducing wobble that increased with distance. The barrel length was 36 inches rather than the standard 30 inches, giving powder more time to accelerate the ball before it exited. Every additional inch of barrel added velocity, and velocity translated to flatter trajectory and less wind drift. The trigger mechanism had been replaced entirely with one designed for target shooting. Production triggers typically broke anywhere between 8 and 12 pounds of pressure, and that range introduced inconsistency. Jacob's trigger broke at exactly 3 pounds every time, tuned with specialized springs and carefully fitted components. The lock mechanism used a higher quality flint than standard equipment, producing more reliable ignition. The stock had been custom shaped to fit Jacob's specific anatomy, with the comb height, length of pull, and grip angle all adjusted so the rifle naturally pointed where he looked when properly mounted. Jacob explained that these modifications individually made small differences, but cumulatively they transformed the weapon's capability. A production rifle might group shots within 6 inches at 100 yards under ideal conditions. Jacob's modified rifle grouped within 2 inches consistently, and that 3-fold improvement in precision multiplied across longer distances. At 400 yards, a 6-inch group became 18 inches or more with a standard rifle, while Jacob's rifle maintained 6-inch groups. The difference between hitting and missing. Thomas asked what these modifications cost. Jacob said the barrel alone cost $40, more than most trappers earned in half a season. The custom trigger work added another $20. The stock shaping required a skilled woodworker and cost $15. Total investment exceeded what many mountain men spent outfitting themselves completely for a year in the wilderness. Jacob said this was why so few men pursued long-distance shooting seriously. The financial barrier combined with the time investment meant that even men who could afford it usually chose not to bother. But Thomas was already calculating how to finance his own rifle. December brought heavy snows to the high country, and Jacob explained this was when serious practice began. Summer shooting was easy, with stable conditions and comfortable temperatures. Winter shooting revealed whether you truly understood the principles or had simply memorized responses to favorable conditions. Cold affected everything. Powder burned differently at 20 degrees below zero than at 70 degrees above. Metal contracted, changing barrel characteristics subtly. Wind in winter carried snow crystals that provided excellent visual reference, but also indicated brutal crosswinds that could push a ball 18 inches off course at 400 yards. Your hands numb despite gloves, making fine trigger control difficult. Your eyes watered in the cold, blurring distant targets. Jacob and Thomas established a winter camp in a protected valley with clear shooting lanes extending in multiple directions. They marked distances systematically every 50 yards out to 800 yards using stakes they could locate even after heavy snowfall. Each morning began the same way. They would shoot 10 rounds at 100 yards to verify their rifles were performing consistently. Then they would move to longer distances, working methodically through 200, 300, and 400 yards. Jacob insisted on recording every shot, noting conditions, results, and any factors that might have influenced accuracy. Over time, Thomas began recognizing patterns. He learned that morning shots, fired when the air was dense and cold, hit slightly higher than afternoon shots after the sun had warmed the valley. He learned that wind gusting through trees sounded different from wind moving across open meadows, and the sound told him which mattered more for his shot. He learned to read mirage, the heat shimmer rising from sun-warmed rocks, even in winter, which indicated wind direction at ground level near the target. He learned that shots fired uphill required aiming lower than instinct suggested because gravity affected the ball's trajectory less when shooting at an angle. He learned that his heartbeat could move the rifle enough to affect accuracy at extreme distances, so he needed to time his trigger squeeze between heartbeats. By January, Thomas was consistently hitting targets at 300 yards. By February, 400 yards became reliable under good conditions. Jacob pushed him to 500 yards, and Thomas encountered the limit of his current rifle. The production weapon he had been using simply wasn't built for that distance. The tolerances weren't tight enough, the barrel wasn't long enough, and the sights weren't precise enough. He could make the ball reach 500 yards, but grouping shots became nearly impossible. Jacob said this was expected and actually represented excellent progress. Thomas had maximized what his equipment could do. Further improvement required better tools. Jacob offered to sell Thomas his secondary rifle for $80, a fraction of what it had cost to build, but still a substantial sum. Thomas had saved some money from his previous trapping season, but not enough. He would need to trap the spring season successfully, then buy the rifle and continue his education the following winter. Jacob agreed this was reasonable. They spent the remaining winter months refining Thomas's technique at distances his current rifle could handle, building skills he would need when better equipment became available. Spring arrived in late March, and Thomas left Jacob's camp to begin trapping. He had locations scouted from the previous year and expected a productive season that would finance his rifle purchase and allow him to continue his education. But 1837 proved disastrous for reasons beyond anyone's control. Beaver populations in Thomas's territory had been trapped heavily the previous season by other outfits, and the remaining animals were scarce and wary. He worked twice as hard as the year before and caught half as many pelts. By mid-June, he knew the season was failing. By July, he accepted that he wouldn't earn enough to buy Jacob's rifle and outfit himself for another winter of practice. Thomas faced a choice. He could abandon his pursuit of long-distance shooting, focus on practical trapping, and try to rebuild his finances over the next several years. Or he could commit completely to learning the skill, even if it meant poverty and hardship. The decision wasn't rational from a financial perspective. Long-distance shooting had no obvious commercial application. It wouldn't make him a better trapper. It wouldn't help him acquire land. It was simply something he desperately wanted to master because it represented possibility and achievement beyond ordinary limits. Thomas chose to continue. He traveled to the summer rendezvous, the annual gathering where trappers sold pelts and bought supplies. He sold his modest catch for barely enough to buy basic necessities. Then he approached several established trappers with a proposition. He would work for them as a camp tender, meat hunter, and general laborer in exchange for minimal wages and the loan of $80. He would repay the loan over the next 2 years from trapping proceeds. The terms were unfavorable, essentially indentured servitude, but 3 trappers agreed to share the loan collectively because Thomas had a reputation for reliability. He now owed $80 at substantial interest. had no savings, and was committed to working for other men rather than himself. But he had secured the money he needed. Thomas returned to Jacob's camp in August and purchased the modified rifle. The weapon felt different from his production rifle immediately. The balance was better, the weight distributed more evenly. The trigger broke cleanly at exactly 3 pounds every time he tested it. The longer barrel changed how the rifle swung when tracking moving targets. Jacob spent a week helping Thomas acclimate to the new weapon, adjusting his technique for its different characteristics. Then they began serious work at extended ranges. The difference was immediately apparent. At 400 yards, Thomas's groups tightened from 18 inches to 8 inches. At 500 yards, where his old rifle had been unpredictable, the new weapon grouped consistently within 12 inches under good conditions. Jacob pushed Thomas to 600 yards, distances where even elk appeared as small shapes that required precise aim point calculation. Thomas missed frequently at first, but gradually his hit rate improved. By October, he could reliably hit a target the size of an elk's vital area at 550 yards. Winter of 1837 brought Thomas deeper into the theoretical aspects of extreme range shooting. Jacob introduced concepts that went beyond practical field shooting into what he called the mathematics of impossibility. At 600 yards and beyond, intuition failed completely. You couldn't see where your shots hit without walking to the target. You couldn't adjust based on feedback because conditions changed between shots. You needed to calculate everything in advance based on environmental factors, then trust your mathematics completely. Jacob had developed tables that predicted bullet drop, wind drift, and necessary sight adjustment for distances up to 1,000 yards. These tables represented over 15 years of accumulated data from thousands of shots. Thomas copied these tables into his journal, but Jacob insisted he understand the principles behind the numbers rather than just memorizing values. They spent hours discussing ballistics theory. A round ball leaving the barrel at roughly 1,000 feet per second began losing velocity immediately due to air resistance. The rate of velocity loss wasn't constant. It accelerated as the ball slowed because rotational stability decreased. At longer ranges, the ball began tumbling slightly, which dramatically increased air resistance and made trajectory unpredictable. This was why extreme range shooting became exponentially more difficult beyond 600 yards. The ball was fighting physics that worked against accuracy. Wind drift calculations required understanding that wind didn't affect the ball uniformly across its flight. A crosswind at the shooter's position might push the ball 6 inches off course, but that same wind, acting on the ball for the entire flight to 600 yards, might push it 60 inches or more. The relationship wasn't linear because the ball was slowing down, spending more time in the wind during the later portions of its flight. Jacob had developed a system of wind reading stations. He would observe wind indicators at his position, at mid-range, and near the target, then average these observations weighted toward the far end of the flight path where the ball was most vulnerable to drift. Temperature affected powder combustion significantly. Cold powder burned slower, producing lower velocity. Jacob had tested this systematically and found that a temperature difference of 50 degrees could change point of impact by 20 inches at 500 yards. He taught Thomas to adjust powder loads seasonally, using slightly more powder in winter to compensate for reduced combustion efficiency. Humidity also mattered, though less dramatically. Damp powder burned inconsistently, which was why Jacob stored his powder in sealed containers with wax-sealed lids and never loaded his rifle until immediately before shooting. Elevation angle introduced complications that seemed counterintuitive. When shooting uphill or downhill, gravity affected the ball's trajectory less than when shooting horizontally across level ground. This meant you needed to aim lower than the actual distance suggested. A shot at 400 yards uphill at a 30-degree angle required aiming as though the target was only 350 yards away. Jacob had worked out these calculations through surveying techniques he had learned years earlier. Thomas practiced angle estimation constantly, learning to judge slopes accurately enough to apply the correct adjustments. By March of 1838, Thomas could consistently hit targets at 600 yards under favorable conditions. Jacob believed 600 yards represented the practical limit for hunting shots with current technology. Beyond that distance, Too many variables became uncontrollable and ethical concerns emerged. A wounded animal at 700 yards could travel miles before dying, making recovery impossible. The probability of clean kills decreased while the chance of suffering increased. But Thomas had become obsessed with pushing further. He argued that if you could master 700 yards, 600 yards became routine. If you could understand 800 yards theoretically, 700 yards became achievable practically. Jacob reluctantly agreed to explore these distances, but only for knowledge rather than actual hunting. They established a target range extending to 900 yards across a frozen lake where wind patterns were relatively predictable. The work became purely experimental. At 700 yards, Thomas's hit rate dropped to approximately 30% even under ideal conditions. At 800 yards, it fell to 15%. At 900 yards, he could barely hit a target the size of a full-grown elk more than one time in 20 shots. The variables multiplied beyond his ability to calculate them accurately. Tiny errors in wind reading, microscopic inconsistencies in powder loads, or fractional variations in ball weight created misses measured in feet rather than inches. Jacob shared something he had never told anyone. Years earlier, he had successfully killed a buffalo at 870 yards. It had required perfect conditions: dead calm air at dawn, flat terrain, clear visibility, and a stationary target. Even then, he had fired 3 shots before connecting, and he admitted the successful shot involved considerable luck. He had never attempted anything similar since because he couldn't reliably recreate those conditions. The shot had taught him that extreme range shooting crossed from skill into chance beyond certain distances. You could improve your odds through knowledge and practice, but you couldn't eliminate luck as a factor. Thomas asked what would be required to shoot reliably at 800 yards or beyond. Jacob said it would require technological advances that didn't exist yet. You would need rifling systems that imparted greater spin without increasing friction. You would need projectiles shaped more aerodynamically than round balls. You would need ways to measure wind at multiple distances simultaneously rather than estimating. You would need optical sights that allowed precise aim point selection at extreme range. You would need powder formulations that burned more consistently across temperature variations. Some of these advances might happen eventually, but not in their lifetimes. They were working at the absolute edge of what current technology allowed, but Thomas continued practicing at extended ranges through the spring of 1838, driven by something beyond practical hunting needs. He was chasing the limit itself, trying to find the absolute maximum distance where skill still mattered more than luck. By May, he had pushed his reliable range to 650 yards under good conditions. At 700 yards, his hit rate had improved to roughly 40%. At 750 yards, he remained unpredictable. Beyond 800 yards, he accepted defeat. Jacob said this represented the finest shooting he had ever witnessed from anyone except himself. Thomas spent the summer of 1838 working off his debt, hunting meat for the trappers who had financed his rifle. The work was routine and unfulfilling after 2 years of intensive study, but he had made commitments that required honoring. By October, he had repaid half his loan and secured permission to trap independently the following spring while continuing payments. He returned to the mountains with enough supplies for a solo winter camp, intending to combine trapping with continued shooting practice. He had learned everything Jacob could teach him. Further progress required independent experimentation. Thomas established his camp in a high valley with excellent shooting lanes and abundant game. Through November and December, he maintained his practice routine while running a modest trap line. His shooting continued, improving incrementally. 700 yards became reliable under good conditions. 750 yards became possible, though not consistent. He began attempting shots at 800 yards regularly, and his hit rate slowly climbed from 15% toward 25%. The improvement came from pattern recognition developed through sheer repetition. He was learning to read conditions at these extreme distances through subtle cues that he couldn't fully articulate, but recognized instinctively. On January 12, 1839, conditions aligned perfectly. The morning dawned absolutely calm, temperature just below freezing, air density ideal, visibility unlimited. Thomas noticed a large buck deer moving across a distant meadow, and he, instinctively began the mental calculations that had become automatic. Distance, approximately 850 yards, based on the size of landmarks he had previously measured, no detectable wind at his position or mid-range. Slight uphill angle requiring adjustment of roughly 50 yards, temperature cold enough to require an extra half grain of powder. The deer was moving slowly, feeding on exposed grass, predictable in its pattern. Thomas loaded his rifle with absolute precision, measuring powder exactly, seating the ball with consistent pressure, priming the pan with fine powder, checking the flint for sharpness. He found a solid rest against a boulder, positioned himself with ritual precision, controlled his breathing into the familiar pattern. He placed his sight picture not on the deer, but on empty air approximately 15 feet above it, compensating for the extreme drop his ball would experience over that distance. The calculation was based on his tables, his experience, and his understanding of how this specific rifle performed under these exact conditions. He waited for the deer to stop moving. When it paused to feed, Thomas squeezed the trigger with exactly 3 pounds of pressure. The rifle fired. Smoke obscured his vision temporarily. When it cleared, he saw the deer still standing, and his heart sank with familiar disappointment. But then the deer's legs buckled and it collapsed. The shot had connected. Thomas remained motionless, almost unable to believe what had happened. He waited another minute to be certain, then began the long walk across the meadow to confirm the kill. With each step, he verified the distance markers he had established in previous months. 846 yards. The ball had struck precisely where he intended. Thomas field-dressed the buck and packed the meat back to his camp, but his mind remained fixed on the mathematics of what he had accomplished. That evening, he documented everything in his journal with obsessive detail: temperature, wind conditions, exact powder load, angle of shot, time of day, and the precise point of impact. This wasn't just a successful hunt. It was proof that 800-yard shots were achievable with sufficient knowledge and preparation. Over the following weeks, Thomas attempted similar shots whenever conditions aligned properly. His success rate at extreme distances remained low, perhaps 30% at 800 yards, but this was dramatic improvement over the 5% rate he had started with. Word of Thomas's shooting ability spread through the mountain man community gradually. Trappers who witnessed his practice sessions carried stories to rendezvous gatherings. Most dismissed the tales as exaggeration, the kind of tall tales common in frontier culture where truth and fiction blended freely. But a few men sought Thomas out, asking to learn his techniques. Thomas remembered his promise to Jacob about passing knowledge forward. He began teaching select students who demonstrated genuine commitment, using the same systematic approach Jacob had used with him. He taught mathematics and observation before marksmanship. He insisted on detailed record-keeping. He emphasized understanding principles rather than memorizing procedures. The men Thomas trained became known for exceptional shooting ability, and several went on to teach others. By the mid-1840s, long-distance shooting had evolved from impossible fantasy to recognized specialty. The techniques Thomas and Jacob had developed spread through the Rocky Mountain region, adapted and refined by each new practitioner. Gunsmiths began producing modified rifles specifically designed for extreme range work, incorporating the barrel lengths, rifling specifications, and trigger refinements that had proven effective. The modifications remained expensive, limiting serious long-range shooting to dedicated specialists, but the knowledge was no longer secret. Thomas eventually left the mountains in 1845, his debt repaid and his savings sufficient to purchase land in the Oregon Territory. He had spent 9 years in the wilderness, and the isolation was wearing on him. He married in 1847 and established a small ranch, living quietly and never discussing his mountain experiences unless asked directly. But his legacy persisted in the mountains he left behind. The techniques he and Jacob had developed influenced military sharpshooter training during the Mexican War and later during the Civil War. The principles of systematic observation, environmental calculation, and weapon modification that had been pioneered for hunting became foundational to military marksmanship. Thomas Whitmore died in 1872 at age 64, surrounded by family who knew him only as a successful rancher. His journals, filled with ballistic tables and shooting records, were stored in a trunk and forgotten. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, hunters still talked about the mountain man who could drop a buck at distances others considered impossible. The shot that had seemed miraculous in 1839 had become routine for those who understood the mathematics of precision. The impossible had become merely difficult, then eventually standard practice for anyone willing to learn.